Good morning. We are having class. Yes. Hopefully you got a handout up front. This is the end of the first hour. Well, no, let me rephrase this. This is week 4, which is the third week of what was supposed to be the 1-hour lesson of week 2. It's just such a important topic that we understand. The world is actively suppressing the truth about the existence of God. The world is intentionally choosing to see the evidence, to see the proof, to see the undeniable divine nature and power of God, and suppressing that truth, exchanging it for a lie. And so we're taking our time, and we're still not exhausting these topics by any means, but I want us to understand that God. Was there no handout on the back table, Brother Billy? All right. That's probably my fault. I was supposed to print them maybe. They did go out. They're on the internet. You can click them on the My Faith Baptist Church website. And I'll try to get them available at least at the end of this class. So it's the final evidence for the existence of God that we're choosing to cover. There are many, many more, and we will be, I think, 3 more weeks into, I guess, head knowledge type, deep thinking type topics before we move into the topics that are more, how shall I say, politically charged, that are more how do we as Christians today answer the position of Christ, of Scripture, to topics today? How does the world think about abortion? How does the world think about racism, sexual orientation, feminism, things of that nature? Gun control, we can throw that. We can talk about a whole hour of Christian apologetics. What's the Christian worldview? And how would we answer that? So, just war theory. There's all kinds of things we could cover. We're trying to give you a sketch of how to think biblically about these things. So this is, like I mentioned, week 4, which is the third part of evidential arguments. That is, things that you see that demonstrate that there is a person, there is a being who is God. And the character of God described in the Bible best fits those evidences. I'll remind us all that it says in 1 Peter, in your hearts, honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. And we should pause and note that there are 2 elements there of our nature that Peter is addressing. He says, in your hearts, honor God as holy. This is the way that you think, the way that you choose to act, the way that you choose to interact with others. And this, being prepared to make a defense, is your investment in your intellectual understanding of God. Remember, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength. So Peter here is kind of putting both of those together, and he's saying we have to be able to do this with gentleness and respect toward others. So, course overview, we're still in this presenting lines of argument that show that there is a being out there that has the quality, character, and nature of God, and the best answer for some being that fits all of those attributes is the God who's revealed in Scripture. Same resources. So here we are with religious experience. Let's pray. I'll give us a quick overview and we'll get into this topic. Father, one of the best ways that we have of experiencing you is actually experiencing you, of seeing your glory. Isaiah, we're reminded, knew you. He had been a prophet to your people, but when he came into your throne room, that was when he was broken. Woe is me, a man of unclean lips. Ezekiel knew of you, but when he saw you, Father, on that chariot he couldn't describe, he was in awe. Zechariah, when he saw the four horsemen called to survey the earth, the same thing, just the awe of your glory in your presence, Father. And we seek today to understand from history how that view of your glory, of that view of your power, majesty, your mercy, your love has changed the course of human history. Father, I ask that this engagement with our minds wouldn't skip our hearts. The engagement with our hearts wouldn't skip our minds. That we would not exclude one in favor of the other, Lord, but that we would use both to glorify you in our whole person. Lord, I pray that you would use me as your instrument today, that you would set apart any anxiety, any tension, any thought of possible controversy, of interpersonal relationship problems, and allow us to focus, because you deserve our full attention, Lord, on you. And I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. I've used this word syllogism before, and it occurred to me that perhaps it may not be part of your regular language use. Is syllogism something you guys are familiar with? No. Okay. Well, let me give you a description of that, and I apologize. Sometimes you just don't know what other people. It's like when you go to England, right? And they say, "Would you like chips with that?" And you're thinking something different than what they're thinking, right? Or crisps, right, are what we think of when we think of chips. So syllogism. A syllogism is the way that you form the argument that you're going to make. I don't mean argument like we're having a fight. I mean, this is the reasonable way that I'm going to demonstrate what I'm going to talk about. When a prosecuting attorney stands before a jury, he has in mind the shape of the argument that he's going to make to show that the defendant is guilty, right? And the defense attorney has in his mind the way that he's going to show that the defendant is not fitting that mold that the prosecutor wants to put on him. They both have a syllogism, a shape or a form of argument that they're going to follow. And one fits with the other, right? It wouldn't do the defense attorney any good to make rebuttals against things that the defendant was not accused of, right? They would just say, well, yeah, those may all be true, but what the prosecutor said is true, and the way his argument is shaped, the conclusion is inevitable. He's guilty, right? So you have to have a defense that matches what the offense is. Maybe for a more football analogy, you can't drop back and cover the deep pass if they're running the ball on you all day long, unless you're Bill Belichick, and somehow that works, right? They just, I guess, confuses the offense, and they don't know what to do. But so the syllogism is the way that we make the case. It's the order and the content of the points that we're going to make, so that if they're all true, the conclusion has to be true. So from religious experience, the syllogism is that based on the statement that we make, let's assume this is true. Okay? We're not saying you have to assume it's true. That's a presupposition. That's when you slide something in without somebody noticing. Like, evolution is true because we see things evolving. Therefore, universal Darwinian evolution is true. Well, somebody just slipped in a presupposition for you. One presupposition that they've assumed in is that science is capable of determining truth instead of observing reality, which it's not. Two, they're saying that because something is happening such a way right now that it has always happened that way, that's not true. We actually know that from experience, yet we presuppose that isn't true with Darwinian, and there's many more. Okay, so this is a postulation. We're saying, let's, for the sake of argument, assume that it's true that people are made in the image of God. That is, we have this imago Dei, which is the classical theologian term for saying God made us to be his representative to other beings, people, and the angels, and all of creation. We started out as God's handiwork with a purpose in mind of bearing witness to the type of God God is. And we had a job to do that. Let's just say that's true. If that is true, if what God said was true, that we were made for that purpose, then it would also be true that we would know and be able to experience our Creator. We have to know what we are representing. We have to be capable of interacting with what we represent. You can't say, I stand for some unknown thing. Even the tomb of the unknown soldier, right? They're standing for what they know to be an unknown number of people who have died that don't have names. They're not standing for an abstract unknown, right? There's something they're representing. They're Americans who gave up their lives and even their very identity in death to defend our nation. And we want to honor that. And that soldier who makes that continual march in front of that tomb of the unknown soldier represents that. The only way that has meaning for that soldier to march back and forth is if he knows what he's representing. Otherwise, you don't do it. And so if God created us in his image, then we have to be able of communicating, of knowing who that God is. And if we can communicate with who God is, then things that happen in history and humanity that show that connection to our Creator are based on a true experience. That experience is true because God is real. There's a chain of logic that is unbreakable if we are made in the image of God. And so then you go into one of those links on that chain and you say, okay, since that chain is unbreakable, have there really been times in history where God has revealed himself to his creation? Because if he has, then there must be a God who has revealed himself. Does that make sense? How that works? If we're made intentionally by a God to represent him, then we have to be able to know that he's there, experiencing him, which means he creates experiences for us, which is something we can evaluate in history. If there's ever been something in history that we can say this is a divine experience, that means that the divine who created that experience must also be true, right? This would be like your child saying, the only one who was home all day was me. And I spent all day in the living room. And Grandma's vase that she handed down from her grandmother to us is broken on the floor. But I didn't do it. No one else was here, right? Well, you've all seen the Family Circle cartoon, Not Me, right? The little ghost child who's guilty of everything. We know that's not reasonable. There's a broken vase. There's one person in there. This is the same argument, just with different content. If there's really been human experiences of God, there must be a God. That's the summary version of it. But I wanted to draw it out because what happens is people will attack individual elements of that argument. Just like we saw with the false analogies happening against the cosmological argument. Remember that one is cause and effect. And the teleological argument is design and purpose. People will attack elements of that and say that it's simply untrue because they make a straw man argument. They change the argument, defeat their changed argument. And if you're not prepared for that, you have your understanding shaken. So inference to the best explanation. And it requires, again, I should have changed these words. Sorry, requires that experiences are veridical. What's a veridical experience? If you get a speeding ticket, why'd I look at you? Because I know you. I'd be looking at Sister Elaine if she was in here, because I followed her one time. Tried to, I should say. I wasn't driving Dawn's car, so I couldn't keep up. I'm just teasing. She's not even here, so sorry. Um, so if you get a speeding ticket, let's say you get a speeding ticket, and you go to the judge, and the judge asks the cop, how do you know that they were speeding? What are bad answers the cop can say? I just assumed he was. It looked like he was. I heard that he was, right? I know that person, so clearly they must have been speeding, right? Those won't fly in a court of law, right? But what will fly? Well, I had my radar gun, and I had it on his car, and it's calibrated, and he was speeding, right? Or the airplane tracked you and counted how fast you were going on the little line markers every mile on the highway. And it took less than 60 seconds to go a mile, therefore you were going over 60 miles an hour. Speed limit's 55, right? So that you can verify what happened. There's actual evidence to say it's verifiable. So if we're going to argue from religious experience, we have to say that that experience is not something that you have simply made up in your mind, okay? It can't be something that you have lied about. But this does happen. We all have children. They don't want to be guilty of anything. We sometimes have grown friends who act like children that don't want to be guilty of anything. Or they don't want to accept responsibility for their guilt. And so they start making false claims of experiences. Oh, I wasn't there at that time or whatever. Another thing that can happen is there can be well, I thought I remembered this happening type experience. I'm sure you were at that 7-Eleven when I drove by. I thought for sure it was there. And really I was thinking about you. You were on my mind. I saw a car that looked like your car. And so I just kind of subjectively made the assumption that was you. Right? It's a subjective reality. Let me give you another example of a subjective reality. If you read this book, you will feel a burning in your bosom that tells you that this book is true. There's no objective reality outside of that. It's your own experience internal to you that is giving you a subjective response to something. This is a party trick that people do at magic acts, right? They break out their little wristwatch, or what do you call that type of pocket watch, right? Watch the clock and listen to my voice. You are getting very sleepy, right? And then you have experiences that nobody else in the audience experienced because they were subjective to you. They weren't based on a reality outside of you. So it's possible that a religious experience could be a subjective truth. We have to be able to know, is this subjective, meaning just me experiencing it, or is it something else that's causing me to experience it? And we can have out of the ordinary experiences that are claimed to be divine. The Major League Baseball got together and held a baseball game at the lot where they filmed what's the movie? If you build it, the Field of Dreams. And the Chicago White Sox had a huge cheating scandal years ago, and they won it's not the Super Bowl, the World Series, but then they got like discredited or disqualified or whatever. So in Field of Dreams, it was the ghosts of all these dudes that come back apparently and get to play again. And so Major League Baseball brought those two teams together to play on the Field of Dreams, and sure enough, the White Sox won the game. If you're a huge baseball fan, you're like, this is God. No, it wasn't. It was a baseball game. And the guy hit a home run at the end, right? But that's out of ordinary, right? It's an out of ordinary experience. And you may claim that to be divine. And then finally, it may actually be a divine experience. When God called out to Samuel, 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 and he went to Eli, he's like, hey, I'm here. He's like, what are you doing here? He's like, what? You called me. I came. He's like, I didn't call you. Go back to bed, boy. He goes back to bed. Samuel, Samuel. He gets up. Hey, I'm here again. He's like, what is wrong with you? I'm trying to sleep. Go back to bed. If somebody calls you again, it's God, right? Probably just sloughing him off like, I'm tired, I'm an old man, leave me alone. But Samuel believed it. Here I am, right? And this really was divine. This is a possibility, right? So when we're looking at this religious experience, we have to say, where in these four possibilities do these experiences fall? And so we're going to make the case that there are three types of divine experiences that are common among all of humanity that are not false claims. They're not subjective claims, meaning applicable to only an individual, but rather they're objective. It applies to everybody, or at least almost everybody. And so it's something outside that's influencing. It's objective. And it's not just claiming some out of the ordinary, this one-time home run at this thing as divine. Those three things are divine longing, or what I'm going to call numinous experiences, that is, experiences of spiritual type entities, and transformational experiences, an encounter with God that has changed the life of a person outside of any possible other explanation. So, experiencing divine emptiness and divine longing. Blaise Pascal wrote a book called His Thoughts. Actually, it wasn't really a book, it was a list of his thoughts. And in this, he had this quote, and I've got three quotes that I want us to read from thinkers from a time ago because they're eloquent, and I am not. So I will use their words. Blaise Pascal says, "What else does this craving and this helplessness proclaim but that there was once a man in true happiness, of which all that now remains is the empty print and trace. This he tries in vain to fill with everything around him, seeking in things that are not there the help he cannot find in those that are, though none can help, since this infinite abyss can be filled only with an infinite and immutable object, in other words, by God himself." When I was learning about divine longing, what's a good analogy, the one that stuck with me, and forgive my carnal flesh, but was you come across a box of donuts. And you open up the box of donuts and you see little rings of chocolate and sprinkles and, the apple fritter grease stain on there. But there's no actual donuts in there anymore. And you say, well, I really want a donut right now. And coffee. Delicious, dark roast, black coffee. French pressed. And somebody brings along a plate of crudité, carrots and broccoli and green bell peppers, and puts it in your box of donuts. So is that good? No. I mean, vegetables are good, but they're not apple fritters. They're not chocolate donuts. They're not Boston cream eclairs. Right? There's something not right about what I just put in that box. It doesn't fill the spot. And so then you throw out the crudité, and somebody else brings along, a bag full of diamonds and dumps it in there. And you're like, well, I could buy a whole lot of donuts for that. But right now, my need is for donuts, and I would just break all my teeth trying to eat those diamonds. That's not fitting. That's not hitting the spot. That's not good. Divine longing is claiming that in the experience of all common humanity, the lack of something is showing there was something that was meant to satisfy that hole. C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity wrote this. He says, "Creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger, well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim, well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire, well, there is such a thing as sex. if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was creatures. I apologize. I was copying and pasting incorrectly. Let me read the actual quote. Is that I was made for another world. So if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably earthly desires were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. Lewis also wrote, "A man's physical hunger does not prove that a man will get any bread. He may die of starvation on a raft in the Atlantic, but surely a man's hunger does not prove that he comes of a race which repairs its body, but surely a man's hunger does prove that he comes of a race, meaning a type of person, not what we talk about race, which repairs its body by eating and inhabits a world where eatable substances exist. In the same way, though I do not believe, I wish I did, that my desire for paradise proves that I shall enjoy it. I think it a pretty good indication that such a thing exists and that some men will. A man may love a woman and cannot win her, but it would be very odd if the phenomenon called falling in love occurred in a sexless world." This is the experience of divine longing that's universal in humanity, that argues that emptiness. Sometimes you've heard it as the God-shaped hole in your heart. Now, what about observing the numinous? This is another syllogism, so let me explain it. There are three parts that are necessary. There is an observer, you or I or somebody else, who has an observation or experience of something of extraordinary nature, meaning it's not something that can happen based on what we know as the regular kind of rules of the physical universe. And what we're observing is known to us to be distinct from ourselves. We're not saying every time I walk, I see these little ghosts floating in my eye, but it's really just I have floaters in my eye because I'm old, right? That's not what we're talking about. We're saying I experience that. I know it's different from me. I know I'm here. I know it's here, and that ain't from here. And typically, this experience will cause a transformational effect. Think of Paul on the road to Damascus. 3 times he gave testimony in the book of Acts to his experiencing the divine. Each time he gave that testimony, it was a little bit different, and I believe that was because he was explaining his experience to a different crowd. And so the explanation to that crowd had to fit what they needed to hear and understand because of the way that they disbelieved. Paul didn't make the same case to the Jews that he made to the Gentiles on Mars Hill. He didn't go into the Jews and argue from an unknown God. He argued from the Old Testament to show Jesus was the Messiah, right? So this experience on Isaiah in God's throne room, Moses in the burning bush, right? Even the biblical description is, I saw a bush, and the more it burned, it didn't burn up. And it talked to me. That's pretty unusual. Anybody ever experienced that? I don't want to ask about your time in the 60s and 70s, right? Like, I know some of you had some of those experiences. But what's important is that these experiences of the supernatural, how are we doing on time? Okay, good. Of the supernatural don't necessarily mean that what you experienced was the God of heaven, and it doesn't mean that you've actually been converted by it. It just means that that experience really happened, that there really is a supernatural out there, right? Just like cause and effect doesn't necessarily mean the God of the Bible. It just so happens the God of the Bible is one explanation that fits all of the observations of all humanity for all time and was written 6,000 years before we had them. You know, what are the odds? Well, none, unless it was actually written by the God who made it all, right? That's the only possible. So in the same way. So let's talk now about the transformational experience. This is what Jesus was talking about in Matthew's gospel when he said, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." How did they come to Jesus? Burdened and heavily labored. How did they leave their experience of Jesus? Resting. That is a transformation. That is an exchange of one for the other, the lesser for the greater. We have had unbelievable changing lives, experiences credited toward Christianity for over 2,000 years. When we read from the historical evidences, we read of some of them. I was just at the Ignite Men's Conference, and we got to hear from a guy who played baseball, Darryl Strawberry, who I'd not heard of before other than a kid in my middle school used to draw sketches of him. And sorry, I'm not a baseball fan, but does that make me un-American? Okay, good. I used to be, and then they went on strike because hundreds of millions of dollars wasn't enough to sit there and chew tobacco and, throw a ball every once in a while. Sorry, getting off topic. So Darryl Strawberry, he was 6'6", 200 and something pounds, raw steel or spring steel and rawhide, right? He was a phenomenal bass. He was fast, could swing the bat, hit the ball real well, right? Probably played Nintendo really good too. He was a super athlete, but his life was a wreck. His family life was a wreck. He told us that he and his brothers had to get his mom out of the house or his dad would have killed them. He said he turned his pain into what made him great as an athlete, but it did not make him great as a human. He said he was an alcoholic, a drug addict, a womanizer. Told us about going to prison in Florida, getting cancer twice, losing a kidney, his life just off the rails. Until he came to Christ. Now he's married, 3 children. His children, he said, would meet other baseball players and they'd be like, "Do you know who your daddy is? Your daddy's one of the greatest baseball players of all time." And he says his daughters go, my daddy's a preacher. Transformed from what many people today think would be the American dream. All-star, multiple World Series champion, women falling at your feet, got so much money you can't even carry it around with you. Diamond rings, invitations to every party and every club. Everybody knows your name. Living the high life. Unsatisfied, empty longing, was a disaster. Nearly cost him his life. Nearly cost him his reputation. But it gave him a testimony. And there have been testimony after testimony after testimony of people who encounter the living God. And beyond the realm of possibility, their lives are changed. One of the things that's important for us to do as Christians, as First Peter told us, is always being ready to give a hope, a reason for the hope that's in you that doesn't just include intellectual arguments about, yes, there's a God, here's all the proofs for there being a God, but also this is where my life was. This is the kind of person that I was. And then I met Christ, and I couldn't stay that way. I didn't want to stay that way. Yeah, it was a process to get to where I am now. Yes, I had to die to my flesh. I had to take every thought captive along the way. I had to face the attack of Satan, who would lie and lie and lie. But when I look at my life today, I know there's no way I got here apart from walking with Christ. It isn't actually possible. And that can be true for you, that experiencing you're having of divine longing. The experience you have of knowing there is an eternal other. That somehow you want your legacy to go on forever because God put in you a desire and a knowledge that you will go on forever and what you do now matters. This is the argument from transformation. Now we need to say, what about those who fall away then? The argument will be made. Yeah, that happens for some. They change for a while. And then they end up like Judas, who was one of the 12 closest with Jesus, sold him out for 30 pieces of silver. You ever had a person try to buy your loyalty, buy your affection, or buy your... I have since I've been here. My integrity is not for sale, never has been. It's happened to me when I was in the Navy. It's not because I'm some super high and mighty person. It's because I know who Christ is and I know what He did for me. I know what He paid. And, whatever that thing is that somebody's trying to buy your integrity or loyalty for isn't worth that cost. But Judas didn't actually know Christ. I mean, he knew the person. He didn't believe in Him. When I say know Christ, he didn't really believe He was the Messiah. He may have even intellectually understood the Old Testament prophecies that he saw Jesus fulfill. He may have intellectually understood how it was that Jesus was performing miracles was none other than the Almighty God. He may have believed in God the Father as a God-fearing Jewish person, and yet did not come to Christ in saving knowledge. And we should not be surprised by this or allow this to break this argument, because Matthew 13, 1 through 3, they went out from us, but they were not of us. For if they had been of us, they would have, so Matthew 13, 1 through 3, 1 John 2:19, let's read that. They went out from us, but they were not of us. For if they had been of us, they would have continued with us. But they went out that it might become plain that they are not of us. Hebrews 5:11 through 6:12 talks about those who aren't really walking the walk and getting in deep with the love of their life, Jesus Christ. They stop at the feeling point. They stop at the emotional exchange, and they stop at that high of, I've been converted, I've been redeemed, I've been baptized, my life is great, but then they never dig into the meat of the word. We get the parable, which is Matthew 13, of the sower and the seed. There is some seed that sprouts. They're living plants, right? But then the sun comes out. They don't have roots. And what happens? They die. They were never sown on that deep soil. And it's not like we are the one who has to take the responsibility to the initiative to do that. It's not that we have to bear down and grit down and say, I got to dig deep. The truth is, when the Spirit changes, you won't have any other choice but to want to get to that meat. And Paul warns some of these Jewish people that are just now coming back to Rome and experiencing conflict with Gentile Christians about what's happened. He says, I got so much to talk to you about. I want to tell you all about Melchizedek, this guy that appears one time in Genesis to Abram, and he pays him a tithe. He's called the King of Peace. He's called a priest, and we're like, who is this dude? Paul says, I know who he is. Let me tell you about it. But wait. You've been focusing on yourselves. You've been focusing on your religious practices apart from studying the Scriptures. You've been persecuting my people like I used to do. You've been dull of hearing, he says, lazy. And he goes on to say what the outcome of a lazy person is. He says it's like land that doesn't produce crops, and all it's good for is for plowing it under and burning the chaff that came off of it. Ouch. This was predicted beforehand that people might have a reaction to God because they want the benefits without the person. They want the popularity without the persecution. They want the crown without the cross. You don't get to choose how Christ is going to affect you, how God is going to make you walk your walk. And he told us of some, like Simon the magician, who would look like Christians, walk like Christians. They'd hear those Christian words. They might write Christian songs. But when the fire comes, turns out 30 pieces of silver is plenty for them. This was known beforehand. So how can you argue and say this means that there is no divine? The divine said this was going to happen. Like your argument for saying it isn't true is actually showing that somebody knew people were going to do this beforehand, and then they did that. What do you call that? Fulfilled prophecy, omniscience, divinity. If you only have an intellectual understanding of God when your heart breaks, that may not be enough. If you only have a heart knowledge of God and your mind is challenged with things that are presented as facts, feelings are fickle. You can go from calm, cool, and collected to ears ringing, red, raging mad in like a word. Go to a Trump convention and say Biden. Watch it happen. Feelings are fickle. We have to have both together, all of our person. And this actually happens over and over and over again across a broad spectrum of humanity, different testimonies. And it's wonderful and awesome. And this is where we plug in when we engage with people. And I recommend you start with your own testimony. How has my life changed? Another thing people will say about this is that you can't use this as an argument to show that there is a God because you can't test for God. You can't put God in a test tube or under a microscope. That's right. I also can't count blue. Right? I can't skin air. It's not an animal. This is what we call a category mistake. On a scale of 1 to 10, you're a cloud. Right? Like, no. It's got to be a number between 1 and 10. Even 9 or even 11 is at least the same category. But saying you can't test for God who has told us he is not of this world, he's like us, that he's got to be worshiped in spirit and in truth, and say, well, I can't use physical means to test for God. I got 1 word, 2 words. That's dumb. That's a category mistake. Right? You're making a false logical argument. Let me read this quote from a theologian named George Mavrodes, who wrote a article, Belief in God, a study in the epistemology of religion. Epistemology is the science of how you know things. And he wrote this: if Christian theologians are correct, then God will be experienced only when He chooses to reveal Himself. The failure then of one person to apprehend God has very little significance against someone else's positive claim, for it is quite possible that the failure stems from the fact that the man is in some way yet unready for that experience, or from the fact that God, for reasons which we may or may not guess, has not yet chosen to reveal Himself to him. Is this begging the question? What does that mean? It's saying, well, only physical objects are real, and I can only test for physical objects. And since I can't test for God because He's not a physical object, that must mean He is not real. Well, you started out your syllogism with the answer you were looking for. Only physical objects are real. That's not even true. Is love real? Is hope real? Is patience real? Is anger real? Long-suffering? Meekness? Kindness? Tenderness? The fruit of the Spirit? Is any of that real? Is any of it physical? It manifests itself in our physical universe. Awfully hard to put love in a box on a slide. Say, there's 4 units of love right there. And we have metaphors, right? Like the Grinch stole Christmas because his heart was 2 sizes too small. And then he gives the little presents back and, right, his little heart grows. We use metaphors. We use poetry. So my answer to those 2 objections are nope. Not good. There are other ways of verifying God besides physical verifications. Our experiences both match the tradition of Christian experiences. Nobody experiences God as, a lost sheep wandering around and you must follow me. Right? No. They're all divine encounters with a being that transforms your life, that you're afraid to be in the presence of because it's so holy. And they match what was predicted. Those are both verifiable things. And we can say not all of humanity has been tripping on LSD every time they have an experience of God. That influence is out of the order. Not every person who experiences God has been under some kind of psychological stress when they experience God. Some people have experienced God in joy, others in persecution, others in just their everyday life. Paul was just a dude on a mission, thought he was doing great things, going on the road to, and bam, right? I'm God. Everybody around him heard the voice, didn't know what it said, saw the light, didn't know what it meant, didn't see the dude. Paul saw the dude. This is not something that we can say, here's a consistent thing that was true of everybody. Ooh, we lost it. Doug? We lost our connection to the... You're going to have to restart the NDI scan tool once I reconnect. Give me the code, please. Y'all getting used to this yet? Notice this happened much, much later this time. And then you'll have to restart NDI scan to and then switch it over to the reflector 4. So, where were we at? Nope. Removing influences that would have affected the perception. And then finally, this isn't a one-time thing or a 2-time thing or a 3-time. This is thousands and thousands of years of experience that has been consistently accredited to the God of Scripture. Finally, what about the projection objection? You just want to believe that there's a God, so whenever you think that you see a God or something about God, that's what you give it credit to. Are you having a hard time with NDI scan? and then click File at the top. So you're not, nope. You got to go back to NDI scan as the program. So click that. See at the top where it says NDI scan tool? All right, hit the control key and the tab key. Hold down control and hit tab. It's the key right to the left of the keyboard. So hold that key down and hit the tab key. I'm sorry, command, not control. Command tab. So press the key directly to the left of the keyboard. And then while holding that key down, hit the tab key. Nothing? Oh, it's all the way on the left-hand side, should be the third key down. There you go. See, now let go. Now go to File at the top. Reflector. Sweet. More than one way to skin a cat. All right. So the idea of this is it projects the desirable attributes of mankind, what we think are good things, onto what we assume to be some super being. And some will say the only reason that you want there to be a religion is because it's politically effective for you to control people. That's why there's a God. Or some say it's just the world is mean and cruel, and the only way you can cope with what's the Blood, Sweat, and Tears song? Something about a mean old world, cold, hard, mean, cruel world. Right? Freud says, hey, God is just wish fulfillment of people who live in a cold, hard, mean, cruel world. You guys weren't into disco? Man, I got to redecorate my house now, in case y'all come over. All right, so what's wrong with this? What's wrong with these arguments against projecting religious experience and saying that's what people experience? Well, a lot of things. First of all, there's a presupposition in every one of those arguments that belief in God is belief in superstition. But we've already talked about it's not just superstition. These are verifiable events. They're not verifiable according to the category error of saying God is a physical being, but they're just as verifiable as other non-physical things are. And there's an element to it that says, hey, you know, belief in God is morally degrading to people. If you believe in God, you're a lesser person. And it's assuming that just because you want something to be true, that doesn't mean that it's not true. I can want to be married to Dawn, and I am. Yay, me, right? Just because I want to be married to her doesn't mean I'm not. So wanting to believe that there's a God doesn't mean that there isn't a God. And there's aspects of believing in God that aren't desirable. Like that whole pick up your cross and follow me. That whole love your enemy as yourself. Yay, God, I love that. Not really. The same wish for truth can be turned against the atheist. Think about our political system today that wants to affirm and make positive every kind of sin that you can imagine. Would it be better for them for there to be no God that declares right from wrong, or for there to be a God that declares right from wrong? No God, right? Because if there's no God, they're not accountable. So saying we don't get to say there's a God because we want there to be a God, or belief in God is something that tends you to cause to believe it, well, guess what? Your not wanting there to be a God causes you to not believe in a God too. So that's a wash, right? That's not an argument. Not in the sense of like something that makes sense. That's an argument like just two people fighting over nothing. And if these projections don't, if these religious experiences are projections, if we really are just hoping for it, well, what was the first argument? Divine longing. If universally humanity longs for something that they project into it, that actually is arguing for the first thing we said was true of this divine religious experience. So your claim that it's just projection is actually for our side, not against it. Yay, good job. What about objections to religious experience? There are actually scientists who are trying to examine the chemistry of your brain and say that experiences of supernatural beings are just malfunctions in your brain programming or chemistry, i.e., just a chemical experience in the mind. Well, we've already experienced our good friend category error. Numinous things, spiritual things, are not physical things. So trying to attribute physical causes to non-physical things is like trying to say, my car didn't start because it's hot in Michigan. Right? Like, so what? That has nothing to do with my car here. We don't have time. So it begs the question. It's saying that, hey, you're assuming that I only experience things because of chemical reactions in my brain. And since this caused a chemical reaction in my brain when I experienced it, that means it wasn't a real thing. It was just this is a circular argument, begging the question. How about diverse religious experience? Well, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Muslims, Buddhists, Hindus, I mean, those guys, balance on one finger and stand for 4 years at a time, right? Like Shaolin monk. Aren't they having religious? Isn't it just everything is numinous or everything is God? Well, I would answer that and say, because a person has misunderstood a religious experience, doesn't mean that there wasn't an occurrence that actually happened, an experience that actually happened. If their religious worldview is inconsistent at some point, that doesn't mean they didn't have an experience that was outside of this physical realm. It just meant they misunderstood it. That is the argument from religious experience. So 3 main lines of evidence. Anybody remember what the first line that we went? Divine longing. The second one, we experience the supernatural and the divine. And the third one was transformational experiences. And so those are verifiable. Those are things that we can point to and say for sure have happened. And the only best explanation for that is there is a God that the Bible then describes. We have a minute or so. Any questions? Anybody's brain melted down? Got to reboot? All right, well, thank you for joining me. It was a pleasure once again to bring to you. Next week, we're going to talk about presuppositional arguments. This is deep stuff next week. We've been kind of wading in the deep end of the pool. I realize that. Bring your scuba gear next week. It's going to be awesome. Thank you very much.